let's shift focus to a growing rift between the US and South Africa that has forced other global powers to intervene. Europe has urged US President Donald Trump to reconsider his decision to bar the African nation from the G20 Summit next year.
This year, history was made on African soil. For the first time ever, the G20 Summit took place in Johannesburg, South Africa, a moment meant to showcase unity, cooperation, and a new global era. But instead, it revealed something very different, a deep fracture in the world order. And the tension came from a place no one expected, the United States. Instead of joining world leaders at the table, the US under Donald Trump chose to stand alone, isolating itself after claiming without evidence that South Africa was facing white genocide. It was a dramatic accusation, one that shocked diplomats across the globe. But what Trump and Washington didn't expect was the response: silence. South Africa didn't panic. World leaders didn't walk out. The summit didn't collapse. In fact, it went on smoothly, almost effortlessly. And as the cameras rolled, president after president congratulated South Africa's leadership, while the US seat remained empty, an empty chair that said more about America's place in the world than any speech could. But the real shock of the summit came at the very end, the moment that crowned everything. Traditionally, the host nation passes the G20 presidency to the next country, in this case, the United States, a symbolic handover, a gesture of global trust. But this year, that moment broke the script. When the US tried to send a low-level official to accept the leadership, South Africa did something no one expected. They refused. And instead, the South African president turned toward the US table, where the seat was completely empty. He placed the baton on the chair, a silent handover to no one. And the craziest part? The room didn't gasp. Diplomats didn't whisper. No one even reacted, because the message had already been understood. The United States may still be powerful, but respect? That's something it's losing fast. For the first time in G20 history, the world didn't wait for America. It didn't chase America. It simply moved on without it. In today's video, we are breaking down 3 major reasons why this summit was a turning point, one that exposed Trump's weakening global influence and revealed a world quietly preparing for a future without American leadership. For the first time since the G20 was created, something unbelievable happened. The United States, the country that usually sets the pace, shapes the agenda, and dominates the headlines, was simply ignored. No special treatment, no deference, no waiting for Washington, and South Africa made that message crystal clear. During the summit, South African Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola delivered a line that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. This G20 does not revolve around the United States. We are all equal members of the G20. Those present have decided the direction the world must take. He said it calmly, but the meaning was explosive, because those words came after something unprecedented, a full US boycott. The Trump administration had announced that no American representative would attend, citing claims of white persecution in South Africa, claims that global human rights experts have repeatedly debunked. To Pretoria, it wasn't a warning. It wasn't even an accusation. It was politics, pure and simple. And instead of bowing to Washington's pressure, the South African presidency did something bold. They ignored the US entirely. They continued the summit. They ran it their way, and the world followed their lead. But here's where things get even more interesting. The world didn't side with the United States. They sided with South Africa. Think about that for a moment. A decade ago, this would have been unthinkable. But in Johannesburg, it became reality. At the center of the summit was one key outcome, a major joint declaration. And despite America's empty seat, the other leaders moved forward without hesitation. They drafted the document. They debated the terms. They signed it, all without a single contribution from Washington. When the news reached the White House, the reaction was immediate. US officials accused South Africa of instrumentalizing its presidency. They claimed Pretoria was refusing an orderly transition of leadership. especially after President Cyril Ramaphosa hinted at symbolically handing the baton to an empty chair. But the declaration itself? That's what really stung Washington, because it endorsed ideas the current US administration wants nothing to do with, acknowledging the full severity of climate change, backing a global shift toward renewable energy, and calling for relief on the crushing debt faced by vulnerable nations. These are positions the United States has been pulling away from, but the rest of the world is now embracing, together, and without American approval. In Johannesburg, the message became impossible to ignore. The world is no longer waiting for Washington to lead. But despite the criticism coming from Washington, South Africa held its ground. President Cyril Ramaphosa stood firm. He made it clear that there was sufficient consensus to adopt the declaration, whether the United States liked it or not. Even when Argentina, led by Javier Milei, abruptly walked out of the negotiations, Milei, one of Trump's closest ideological allies, rejected the declaration at the last minute. His foreign minister Pablo Quirno announced that Argentina cannot support the declaration, though he insisted the country still valued G20 cooperation. Their argument: the text didn't go far enough on certain geopolitical issues, especially the Israel-Palestine conflict, which Argentina claimed was not fully reflected. But here's the part that truly matters. Aside from Argentina, every single country at the G20 supported the declaration. Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. They all agreed on a unified direction: tackle climate change, push for global debt reform, build a fairer economic system for developing nations. 2 countries, just 2, stood outside that consensus: the United States and Argentina. And in that moment, the world saw something unmistakable. When it comes to global cooperation, Trump's America is no longer leading from the front. It's standing alone. Yes, the United States is standing alone. The rest of the G20 spoke with one voice, calling for responsibility, cooperation, and a shared global future. But the US chose a different voice, a voice that essentially said, "You're on your own." And if you look closely, this isn't new. It's been Trump's foreign policy blueprint from day one. His America First doctrine didn't just shake rivals, it rattled America's closest friends. We remember when Trump slapped tariffs on Canada and Mexico, countries that share borders, economies, and decades of partnership with Washington. We remember the sudden tension, the confusion, and the fear of a trade war between neighbors who had never imagined turning against each other. Yes, the disputes eventually calmed. Yes, deals were renegotiated, but the damage was already done, because the fact that the US was willing to treat its allies like adversaries told the world something bigger. America's relationships are no longer guaranteed. Its commitments are no longer stable. Its influence is no longer automatic. And that's exactly what the G20 Summit exposed for everyone to see. While the world is moving forward, together, the United States is drifting to the sidelines. And unless Washington changes course, it won't just be ignored at summits. It will be left behind. But then, something unexpected happened during the summit. A diplomatic alliance that had been silent for almost a decade suddenly woke up. IBSA, a strategic partnership between India, Brazil, and South Africa, created more than 20 years ago to deepen cooperation in energy, trade, technology, and development. For years, IBSA was overshadowed by BRICS. Its meetings stalled, its agenda froze. Many assumed it was finished, but not anymore. In Johannesburg, IBSA came back to life, louder, stronger, and more ambitious than ever. And here's the twist. Just moments after South Africa officially ended its G20 presidency, it took over leadership of IBSA from Brazil. Within days, the 3 countries moved with unusual speed. They organized a fresh IBSA summit. They laid out a new roadmap. They made it clear, South-South cooperation is entering a new era. In his closing speech, President Cyril Ramaphosa didn't sugarcoat it. He said the world is changing rapidly, and India, Brazil, and South Africa refuse to be passive observers. They're not just asking for a seat at the table anymore. They're reshaping the table. India, Brazil, and South Africa are not merely participating in global economic governance, Ramaphosa declared. They are working to shape the global agenda, a statement that felt less like a comment and more like a warning to the old powers. Ramaphosa didn't stop there. He revealed IBSA's new priorities: clear, ambitious, and unmistakably bold. Climate action, a just energy transition, food and health security, fair access to technology. Then he delivered the line that set the tone for the future. We must position ourselves as co-architects of a more representative and responsive multilateral system. In other words, IBSA isn't asking for permission. It's stepping into the role of global architect. Ramaphosa warned that the growing gap between rich and poor can no longer be ignored, and that only inclusive economic growth can fix it. But why is this such a major setback for Trump? Because IBSA represents something Washington has always been uncomfortable with: a confident, coordinated global South alliance that speaks with its own voice. IBSA demands fairer trade rules. It pushes for reforms in global financial institutions. It calls for more power for developing nations. And for an America that prioritizes only its own interests, these demands directly clash with US policy. Now, with IBSA suddenly active again, Trump faces a stronger, more united bloc, one that refuses to bend under American pressure. And the timing? Nothing could be worse for Washington, because BRICS is rising at the same time, expanding, strengthening, redefining the global order. And here's the kicker: India, Brazil, and South Africa, IBSA's core, are also core members of BRICS, meaning Trump isn't dealing with one alliance, he's dealing with two, working in parallel and growing more powerful by the day. So while the United States was trying to contain the rise of new powers, three of those very powers quietly reignited a partnership built to challenge the very global system Washington once designed. But the most dramatic moment of the entire summit came during the handover of the G20 presidency, a moment that traditionally follows a very strict protocol. Every year, when one country finishes its term, a top official from the next host nation steps forward, publicly, symbolically, to accept the baton of leadership. But this year, everything changed. In the weeks leading up to the summit, Trump announced that he wouldn't attend. Still, he insisted the United States would be represented by Vice President J.D. Vance. Then suddenly, just days before the meeting, Trump reversed course. He declared a complete U.S. boycott: no officials, no representatives, no presence. At least, that's what the world thought. Because here's the twist almost no one noticed. Up until October, the United States was actively involved in the G20 finance track preparations. American delegates attended the meetings. They participated in the negotiations. They engaged with global partners. And beyond government channels, U.S. organizations and advisors were deeply present through the G20's engagement groups. In fact, while the political drama dominated headlines, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. The B20, Business 20, had one of the largest U.S. contingents at the summit. Their transition for the 2026 hosting duties went smoothly. No controversy, no boycott, no drama. And despite Washington publicly rejecting parts of the summit's agenda, the U.S. still pledged $4.6 billion to the Global Fund to fight HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. A silent reminder that, even in moments of political tension, America wasn't entirely absent. It was a strange contradiction. Politically, the U.S. walked away. Practically, it never fully left. And that contradiction set the stage for the most shocking moment still to come, when South Africa turned toward an empty chair and handed the United States the G20 presidency anyway. But instead of gaining leverage at the G20 summit, the United States did the opposite. By insisting on its boycott, by refusing to show up, by treating the summit like a political game, Washington lost ground. And when it finally changed its mind at the very last minute, what did it do? It didn't send a senior leader. It didn't send someone with authority. It didn't send anyone who matched the weight of the moment. The US tried to send a junior official, someone far below the level expected at a G20 handover. It wasn't diplomacy, it was pride. Rather than admit it had miscalculated, the US doubled down and made the insult even worse. Maybe Washington believed South Africa would simply accept it. Maybe it assumed that a country in the global south wouldn't dare push back, but South Africa saw it for exactly what it was, a disrespect. And President Cyril Ramaphosa didn't hide his reaction. He didn't pretend it was normal. He didn't smile to keep the peace. He rejected it immediately. Ramaphosa insisted, calmly but firmly, that the United States must send someone of proper rank, just like every other nation. No exceptions, no shortcuts. And in that moment, something powerful happened. The entire room understood the message. Africa will no longer accept being treated as second class, not even by the United States. For decades, the West has approached the African continent with the same attitude, that Africa should listen, obey, and stay quiet while others decide its future. African leaders have called out this mindset again and again, but still, nothing changed. And too often, Africa's own leaders have accepted the disrespect, shrugging it off as just how things are. But not this time, not at this summit, not under South Africa's watch, because Johannesburg wasn't just a diplomatic meeting, it was a turning point. But what South Africa did at the G20 was rare, a moment Africa doesn't often get, a moment where a nation on the continent stood up clearly and confidently against the West. And here's the interesting part. This wasn't the first time South Africa challenged the United States and won. One of the biggest sources of tension between Washington and Pretoria goes back to South Africa's bold decision to take Israel to the International Court of Justice. The world watched. The US protested. Diplomats scrambled, but in the end, South Africa won, and then South Africa won again in a later ruling. It was a moment that rewrote global expectations, proving that even smaller nations can force accountability on the world stage. So when South Africa pushed back at the G20, it wasn't a surprise. It was a pattern, a new diplomatic identity, and for Trump, that stance was nothing short of a slap in the face. Instead of showing leadership at the summit, the United States ended up looking unprepared, uninterested, and completely out of sync with where the world is heading. By the time the summit ended, something had shifted. America looked smaller, the global south looked stronger, and the empty US chair became the symbol of a new global reality. Because what happened at the G20 wasn't just about one summit, it was the latest chapter in a story that has been quietly unfolding. A story of declining US influence and rising power in the global south, especially since Trump returned to office, a story that is far from over. The United States under Trump is losing influence, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And the craziest part, Washington still hasn't realized it. For decades, the US walked into global meetings expecting the world to fall in line. It expected obedience, it expected silence, it expected leadership by default. But at this summit, everything flipped. Almost every major country backed the joint declaration. IBSA returned stronger than anyone expected, and South Africa pushed back firmly against disrespect. For the first time in years, the global south spoke with one voice. Africa, Asia, Latin America, united, confident, unapologetic. Meanwhile, the United States stood completely alone, ignored, isolated, out of sync with the direction the world is moving. And here's the truth the US has missed. Power doesn't disappear in one big dramatic moment. It fades, slowly, through tiny cracks the dominant country doesn't see. A refusal to sign a climate and debt declaration, a new alliance rising from the shadows, a public embarrassment during the symbolic baton handover. None of these moments seem world-changing on their own, but together, they tell a story. The world is shifting, new powers are rising, and the old order, led by the United States, is no longer guaranteed. Africa is demanding respect. Asia is taking the lead. Latin America is stepping forward. And for the first time in a very long time, the United States is no longer at the center of the global future.